and welcome to Right Hearted with me, Stuart Wakefield. I am delighted to be joined by Gwen Tolios today. Gwen is a short story author and municipal liaison for the Naperville region of National Novel Writing Month. Gwen, it's great to have you. Thank you very much.
Oh, of course. I'm excited to be here.
I'm very, very pleased you're here. As with all writers, I'm really interested in how you started writing. So can you tell me about, when you first got the bug?
Oh, way early, elementary school.
Really?
I actually remember a teacher assigning short stories and wanting us to write different stories every day, and I couldn't. I wanted permission to continue my story from the previous day.
Right, okay.
And just kept going.
Right.
So it hit me pretty early, doing short things, like usually for school. But then I started writing a little more serious, creating my own more elaborate works and the likes in middle school, high school time.
Right. Okay.
So age, that would be like around 13.
Okay, so you were kind of always in it for the long haul. It wasn't just like bits and pieces. You wanted to write a full and complete story.
Yes, yeah. And that really hit me about 13, like I said, because when I was in elementary school, I wanted to continue with things, but never really finished it.
Okay.
But 13 is when I was like, I want to do something complete, start to finish. And then also that's when I started to want to share things.
Okay. And how did you feel when you first started sharing things? Because I know that can be quite a big moment for many authors.
Right. And it's funny that you actually asked that, because last week, one of my old high school friends found a zine that we put together in high school. So it was the first publication that I had ever done. And I'm flipping through this and I'm like, oh my goodness. But I could tell all of us were really nervous about being published because we all used pen names.
Okay.
So none of us actually had our real names, even though it only got distributed to our high school. And maybe that's because we used pen names, because you don't want to be judged by your peers, especially when you're very sensitive the first time you have something out there. But I still remember being so happy to have that in my hand when I first got it. Of course, when I was going through the PDF last week, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this is what I had published.
Because I've always envied, and I don't know how prevalent it is, but when I watch, American teen stuff, a lot of them have the local kind of school newspaper. And that isn't something that really sort of happened at in a British school. So your zine, that was kind of separate and distinct to your school newspaper?
We actually didn't have a school newspaper.
Okay.
So, right?
Yeah.
So I went to a really small town, and so anything local was in the community newspaper. Right. We didn't have one specific for the school.
Okay. And then how did your writing develop once you kind of left school?
So it really kicked off once I hit college. So by the time I was in college, I was doing a lot of short stories, some that I was putting online, and I'll admit, because when you're young, I really got into fan fiction.
Okay.
And so I did a lot of that I was sharing online. But my junior year of college, I ended up getting accepted to a creative writing class.
Nice.
So you had to submit a story, the professor had to approve you, and I got in there with one of my roommates at the time.
Okay.
And so that was just a real big push for me to get serious about it. And so my writing really started, I would say, to develop and kick off then.
Okay.
Because then I had some instruction. I had a professor that I could work with. I had a roommate who was also interested in writing, and so we could pass things back and forth. Mm-hmm. That's also the time that I found my first critique group.
Okay.
So that also helped really well. And my critique group was actually not fellow students. Okay. So it was adult writers who were a little beyond me in publication. So one of the members had an agent. Someone else was really invested in self-publishing. Someone had a history of having small short stories being published. And so that was also really good. Okay. Able to just communicate with a variety of writers and have them help guide me.
Okay. And what did it feel like joining a group like that?
Oh God, I was so nervous at first. Here I am, this stinky little college student. Everyone else had at least 15, 20 years on me. I was just oh my God, I hope I'm not awful. So it was very intimidating at times. But it was a nice balance because I felt that the students that I had in my class, we were all learning and we were all very open to these discussions, more about like the story and how we felt about the work. And then when I was in my critique group, it was a lot more about like the structure and plot. And so I kind of had the both of them together. And I really was just grateful for both of them at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like that kind of perfect mix of those two worlds. I always think there's a bit of an art to critiquing. So when you kind of started, I mean, how do you feel like your critiquing has kind of developed, or some of the nightmares that you've seen? Because I've seen a few big falling outs. So how did you learn? What did you feel most comfortable with? Was it your critiquing group at, with all these adult writers, or at college?
I actually felt a little more comfortable doing it with the adults. So, and the reason for that is they were also very different critiquing styles. So in my class, it would be, you would go around the room and you'd be like, here's something I like, here's something I didn't like. So very generic, but you also it was a much larger group. So you had to get through like 15 people's opinions. But that was, it's kind of where I started to also see that there's always going to be that difference of opinion. So there would definitely be times where like I would not really like a piece that one of my fellow students like I was just like didn't get it, and then other people in the room would be like, oh my god, I thought this was the most hilarious thing ever. And so getting used to, and this is something that I will still struggle with critiques, is to me critiques are always supposed to be critical. They're meant to point things out to improve, and learning that that's not always what you should be doing with them. So I started learning that with the other students, because I was seeing that my opinion didn't necessarily match everyone else's. And then when I was with the older writers group, I was finding that a lot of the critiques weren't as emotion-based, but they were a lot more, and I also don't want to say structured, but a lot more designed as guidance. So like, this made me feel this, like specifically pointing to things in the text, whereas a lot of the students were just like, I liked it, or I didn't like it, but we were all learning. We didn't know. And so working with these other people who were more advanced writers and more advanced critiquers actually helped me realize that critiquing isn't always about being super critical, which is like what I said, what I thought it should be. And that's how I had always wanted to be critiqued too, actually, is I wanted that really critical reads. But it is also a chance to tell people what you liked, to make connections. And that's something that's kind of helped me go through life too. Like, my day job is actually an analyst. And so I'm always looking for these patterns. And I feel like it's kind of gone hand in hand sometimes with my critiquing, especially if I'm helping people across a larger work. What patterns might I be seeing? How can I, connect the dots between what I'm feeling as I'm reading it and the words that are actually on the page. But you had to start somewhere, and I'm still working on it. But those first two groups were very instrumental in helping me figure that out.
I mean, what I have noticed is certainly with like younger readers and writers, if they engage with the premise of the story, they are a lot more forgiving of all the technical stuff that an older critiquer can't see past, I guess.
Very much so. And one of the things that I actually also did while I was in university is I volunteered with a group called 826 Michigan. And it was a nonprofit that ran creative writing and critique groups for middle school and high school students. So that was also like very like you said, it was kind of being really kind of like guiding people and being very aware of what you're saying. Because it's designed to help people. And that was definitely in a situation where I felt that I had a power position and I had to be a lot more concerned about that. God, I mean, like writing has just been part of my life for a long time.
Do you know, it's interesting because you're the first person I've interviewed who's kind of always, like pretty much always know what they wanted to do. And I've always envied people like that. if you see musicians, they're like, oh yeah, I picked up a guitar when I was 3. And I do find it really interesting when you've got that kind of continuum of writing, because you're used to expressing yourself. And so certainly when I first started writing, I mean, I was all over the place, and I thought just by watching TV, I knew what story was. But actually, as I've grown and developed and done my MA and all that kind of stuff, you do learn to step back and look at things more critically. And it's very freeing when you first start writing like that. But, for you personally, I envy that you've been able to do it that much younger. So you've been writing at school, you've been writing at college, you've been in this critique group. What happened when college kind of finished?
So when college finished is when I started submitting stories to magazines and publications. Right. It was a different time. I had to submit it like in an envelope through the mail.
Wow, okay.
There was no email submission.
Old school.
So and none of those original stories that I sent out, got picked up, which, is for the best. I actually went through a few of them recently and I was like, yikes, no wonder.
Okay.
But, I was still new. And at that point I was very new to wanting to write from an aspect of sharing it not just online for free, but actually getting it published. Right. That's really when I started to have that mindset. And a lot of that helped from that external critique group, because here was someone with an agent. Like, I looked through her proof copies. I was like, this is so cool. So that is what ended up happening when I left. But I only had about a year until I joined the Peace Corps. Okay. And then so Peace Corps was an interesting time, I will say. Bad. You're pretty isolated. Okay. Like, you don't have anyone, like you have like your neighbors and such, but your neighbors are going to be foreign nationals. So it's sometimes hard to integrate. Okay. But I also felt that was a very productive time for me. Okay. Because I would have a lot of alone time. I would have my laptop, and so I could just be like, let's write. So I would do a lot of binge writing. Like, it'd be like 2 a.m. and I'd be in bed and the lights would be off and I'm still just like typing in the dark. Oh, heaven. The computer glow. I had to fill the time somehow, And while I am a short story writer at heart, that is where I actually ended up starting to get into some more longer works that I was comfortable with. Okay. Because I had the time, I had the ability. Anytime you go someplace new and you travel, I feel like that's also a lot of inspiration. Okay. So I had a lot of stuff to work from.
Good. And so you've talked about, you've been working on you have worked on some longer work before. How did you find the difference between the two? Because, from other writers I've spoken to, it seems like not a completely different skill set, but certainly one that kind of needs to be modified. So for you, writing short stories, how do you think that differs, or what lessons did you learn when you started writing longer form fiction?
Well, mainly that I kind of sucked at it. And the issue is because I tend to approach them very differently. And this is something that I'm still trying to figure out myself, because right now I am writing both short stories and longer. I sometimes I hesitate to call them novels, because as I edit them, sometimes they get big, sometimes they get small, and they're more like in the novella range, so like 30, 40K versus a true novel. And I approach them very differently. So when I approach short stories, what I'm doing is it's really, I guess, kind of like poetry. You're trying to isolate one small section. Mm-hmm. So I'm isolating a particular bit of character tension, or I'm isolating a particular event, a particular feeling. A lot of my short stories end up also being cathartic writing. Okay. So tending to really focus in on that. And then every time I'm doing a longer work, I find that I try to plot it. Okay. I never plot my short stories. Okay. I just sit there and I write. I'm like, okay, now I'm done. Whereas with novels and the longer works, I'm like, okay, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's like maybe some senses of arcs and the events I want to happen. But I'll admit, that's what I usually struggle with the long works, is because I don't naturally think that way. I have to force my way to think into like, how would I construct an arc? I have to force myself to think about like, what would be the different beats of a plot. I find that a lot of times my work gets bloated because, like I said, for short fiction, like I'm focusing in on these little conversations. Well, you can't have 7 of those same little conversations in a novel.
Right.
Like it gets, the dialogue might be different, but the emotions are probably the same. The situations around it isn't changing. You're just in the kitchen 3 times.
It feels like my life.
Right. So they're definitely different skill sets, and some things transfer and some things don't. And I do find that they are completely different mindsets. It's not as simple as taking a short story and adding more elements to it. You have to do a lot more.
Yeah. I was working with a script editor, and he said something to me. And we ended up talking about novels, even though he was my supervisor for my MA. And he said to me, novels are about, no, what was it he said? He said, novels are about the most important time in someone's life, and short stories are about the most important moment in someone's life.
I would agree with that. Yeah. And a lot of short stories, like I listen to them more than I read them. There's just a lot of podcasts out there that do it. But a lot of them tend to be about like those pivots, and you don't have a lot of conclusions sometimes in the stories because they are those microcosms. And so, yeah, definitely, I would agree with that. I know what I like to think about is, I think it's Mary not Colwell who said it, is they linked different types of story lengths to sporting events. Okay. So like the novels, the Olympics, and then the short stories are the highlight reels. Okay. So there's always different levels of the story you could be telling. But getting to that and knowing which level to talk about can also be really difficult.
All right. Okay.
Not everyone wants to watch all the Olympics either. Yeah. Some people just really want to watch curling. So.
I must admit, I'm not like, I don't think of myself as a big short story reader, but when I do read, a short story that kind of really speaks to me, I do find myself flipping back through it and scanning it to see, are there any extraneous words in here, or is it also with like themed? And I think one of the things that I have struggled with, so you mentioned trying to make a short story longer, is, sometimes if I've just written a page or a scene or something like that, you can't really build it out, because just making those sentences longer feels like we have an expression like flogging a dead horse. And yeah, it does.
Oh, yep, I'm familiar.
Right. Okay. So it does really, really feel like an art. And I did a development edit with an author who'd written 12 short stories, one for each month, and wanted to make them into one novel. And we found it, incredibly difficult to find a way to do it. And in the end, we found a couple of characters, and we strung those characters through every story and gave them an arc. But that was the only way we could kind of really get around it. So speaking of short stories and, opening yourself up to many other people, how did you first hear about National Novel Writing Month?
Oh, do you know what? I don't actually know.
Okay. That's interesting. It just kind of slipped in.
Pretty much. Like, weirdly enough, where I think I might have heard it is, I think I mentioned a little bit before, like when I started, I got very into fan fiction. Right. And I think I learned about National Novel Writing Month in an author's note on a story. Okay. They had written it as part of Nano. Right. And then I was like, oh, like a writing event with support and other people doing it with you. Let's try. Okay. So I do remember that I did my first one while I was in undergrad. Okay. So while I was still a student, right. Which, and then I've done it almost every year since. Okay. I think I've done 12 years of Nano now.
That's commitment.
Right? It's so long.
So, I mean, doing it as an undergraduate as well, I mean, it's a big time suck. I mean, I know it's only 1 month, but even so, I mean, that's very, very intensive on top of your studies. How did you kind of manage all of that?
I have an interesting relationship to writing.
Okay.
So where I sometimes find myself that I really need to write. So I would be sitting in lectures and I'd be like, oh, this could be the next part. Um, so I was kind of brainstorming that, and because it is hard because you've got studies and you've got exams around that time. In some cases, you've got the holidays. So my parents would be like, "Why are you writing? It's Thanksgiving. Come have turkey with us." Um, but to kind of a better example of how I went through it might have been when I was in grad school.
Okay.
So when I was in grad school, I also did nano.
Wow.
One of the few years I did not hit the 50K words. But I remember sitting in my apartment trying to study for an exam I had the next day.
Okay.
And I could not concentrate because I knew that evening the Locres Writers Group was meeting in the cafe down the street, and they were doing a session where they would just shut up and write.
Right.
And I was so preoccupied with the idea that I wasn't there writing with them that I couldn't focus on my studies.
Wow. Okay.
I was like, oh, damn. Damn. Okay. So I stopped studying and I went to write at the cafe.
You did. And how did the exam go?
I don't remember, but I graduated,
Who cares? I graduated. Like, it's fine.
Right? That's what matters. Absolutely. I got my degree. Absolutely. I got a job afterwards. Like, come on. But so balancing school and writing and now even like life and writing and work is just something I do, probably because I maybe don't sleep enough and maybe drink too much coffee.
Right. Okay.
But I also it's always been a at least a medium priority for me. So I'm always trying to find the space to write. Having writer friends is also really nice. So then your hangouts, like, hey, I haven't seen you in a while. Let's go to a cafe and write.
Do you know? It works out. Do you think something magical happens when writers get together? Because
totally.
Yeah, I remember my first writing. Everyone else is sitting around writing, and I mean, we weren't speaking. And I wouldn't be doing this podcast if I didn't like talking. And there was something very powerful about just sitting with other people that are writing. And it wasn't like a competitive thing. It was just I don't know. There was a degree of comfort and a degree of energy that I was getting from those other people. So, I know people say, that writing is a very lonely, pursuit, but I disagree. I think once you find other writers, you kind of want to be with them. Yeah.
And that's why I really liked Nano.
Right. Okay.
Because you had that community. You'd go and you would sit in a cafe with other people and you just sit there and write. Yeah. You're like, this is amazing. Yes. We would all be working on different stories, obviously, but we all had that same drive. We were there. We wanted to create. And it's sometimes helpful for like the little moments where like, I need a name. Someone give me a boy's name. Or I need a name of a town. Someone hit me up. Yeah. Or little plot helps. Like everyone is like, yeah, tell me about your story. Let me do it. And then you just go back to writing silently for 20 minutes. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, it was a real eye opener for me. So National Novel Writing Month. The idea is that you write 50,000 words in the month of November, but you're a short story writer. So how did you? So if you don't do that, you're called a nano rebel. So what did you do?
I do a little bit of everything. Okay. So when I first did Nano, I was trying to write novels. Okay. And I would hit the word count, but they would be really bad.
Okay.
But I've also had a lot of rebel years where instead what I was doing is I might have been taking a work and I would be editing it. Okay. So that was something that I've done. I did a few years where I just wanted to churn out a bunch of stories, maybe around a theme. Mm-hmm. This past year, actually, like COVID just sucks. And I wasn't feeling super creative. So I turned it into a creativity month. Okay. So everyone else would be Nano was very virtual. So all of our write-ins weren't at coffee shops. They were on Zoom. But everyone would be sitting there on their laptop, and I would have this giant notebook up. And my goal was to write 50 handwritten pages of just world building and plots and characters.
Nice. Okay.
And so I flipped between like 10 different stories trying to put things together. So I turned it more into a creativity month. And Nano for me has progressed kind of from being like, let's sit down and write a novel to let's just have very focused writing time with a community of writers that is pretty much absolutely dedicated to their projects for this month. Like during Nano, I remember one year I never even went grocery shopping the entire time.
Really? What, just to get everything in?
Well, it was, so I had gone like grocery shopping right before, which helped. But then my region has a really good partnership with a lot of local libraries. And so it wasn't uncommon for us to go to a write-in and, the library had food for us.
Oh, nice.
Or, maybe we're doing a write-in at a bar or a cafe or a restaurant.
Let's get trashed.
So then I don't need to eat the food in my fridge, So I would just like stock up in like frozen meals or things that would last, lots of pasta.
Yeah, Cheerios.
Right? So then you didn't have to go grocery shopping that month. But that's not uncommon. And that's part of what makes Nano cool is people tend to sacrifice things in order to focus on this project. Maybe it's family time, maybe it's TV time, but we're all 100% dedicated to our project. And it helps because we have the community around us to do it with.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned lockdown. I just wanted to get your kind of view on that. So what I've noticed is my friends who say I'm not creative, they've all bought these colour by numbers paintings, and they're all getting into craft and doing all this amazing creative stuff. Most of the creative people I know have completely stopped, and they're finding lockdown really difficult in which to be creative. And a part of me wonders, obviously, you said that you work as an analyst. When I was working a full-time job, I would snatch all of those pieces of time that I had to write. So if I got to work early, I'd write before 9 a.m. I'd grab writing time at lunchtime. And then now I have all the time to write. I feel like some of the drive has gone. How do you do you have any particular, like, not tips, but any kind of tricks that or how have you kind of melded your day job and your writing?
Well, if it's a slow day at work, I might open up the document on my work computer.
Yeah, I've done the same.
So, right? Yeah. But it's weird. I feel like sometimes my best writing flow might be during the hours of 9 to 5 when I should technically be working. And I think it's because it feels like secret stolen time. So I know I have to be super productive during that time period where like everything else, I'm just like, I can write or I can clean my bathroom or I could do this. So what helps is I have to force myself. Okay. One of the ways that I do that is by my current writers critique group type of person thing. We have weekly writing sessions. Okay. So I know that this is 4 hours every Thursday. People put aside the time to write. Okay. And knowing it's writing time is like, okay, this is going to be my focus is really helpful. What also helps me is I'm a big fan of like deadlines and to-do lists because if it's not in front of me, I'm going to forget it. Especially because I tend to be more of a binge writer. Okay. So I might not write for a while and then the whole weekend will go by and I'm like, I turned out 15,000 words. How did that happen? So I'm trying, like, I want to get into a more regular rhythm of it too. So I have my phone alert me and I have a to-do item of just 10 minutes every day. Okay. So forcing myself to do that, 10 minutes isn't very long. Like in 10 minutes is probably how long it takes my French fries to cook in the oven. So that is helpful. Yeah. But then also kind of branching out what is part of writing. Okay. For if that makes sense. So for me, part of writing would be like researching markets figuring out where I want to submit a story. Then I'm still kind of in that headspace, even if I'm not maybe having a creative flow. But also reading. I tend to read for pleasure because I'm like, yeah, this sounds cool. But I also tend to read because I'm like, this might be a market I want my story to get into. What are they publishing? Here's a story that would it be a comp title, perhaps. Let me read that.
Right.
What's happening in the market? Or right now I have a few nonfiction books. And I'm like, this might just be like good research. So having that creativity comes and goes. Like, let's be honest. And forcing it is not the best thing, but that doesn't mean you still can't be working on things to prepare you for when your creativity hits you.
And you mentioned you were in one of your classes at college, and you had an idea for something. And I do think a lot of writers aren't always 100% present. I do think that, there is like 10, 15% in the back of their head, even though when they're watching a movie and like a particular line comes up or a particular, scene happens. And I think for writers, they're like, oh, I can use that. So I think personally, my view is this rule that you have to write every day. I think it's useful, but like you, I mean, I do sit down for 4 hours every day, but that's because I get to. But before that, I did exactly the same thing. I would binge write. I might have a week off. Obviously in between novels, I would take a bit of time out, just do other things. So your writing group that you're in now, how did that come about?
So it's actually a migration of my Nano region. So what ends up happening is Nano happens, everyone is like really riding high from the creativity. Hey, I finished something. But once you finish something, there's more steps. If you want to get published, not everyone does. Sometimes people just like to write for the joy of it. So my Nano region kind of morphs into a year-round writers group. It's a little less. More people are involved in Nano than the writers group. But then the writers group has just been really good at sharing resources, helping people, setting up events to do. So, and how it's structured is different people will lead different things. So, like as a municipal liaison during November and before that, like also in October, because you've got all the prep stuff, I tend to do a lot of workshops. So I'll read maybe, I'll read a book and I turn it into writing advice and I share it. Something I've done for a few years now is like how to write a novel when you have no plot. We go to the library and people are like, yeah, teach me. I'm like, okay.
You don't have a plot, just write a short story.
Right? It's kind of funny because like it's the kind of a running joke in our group is that I am a plot or a pantser. I don't plot because, like I said before, like with short stories, that's not how I think. I think about this one thing and then we expand. And then, for a short story, like it only expands to maybe 2,000-3,000 words. For a novel, I try to take this thing and it doesn't always expand correctly. But the joke is like, I never have a plot. So of course I'm the person you're going to go to. Like, how do I write something if I don't have any idea? I'm like, I got you. So... and that's kind of what the group does a lot. And then something that comes out of that is there are a lot of people in the group who are very interested in getting published. So the group runs an anthology. And that's kind of where also I have stepped up and taken some leadership role in addition to the Nano work. It is getting involved with the anthology. I was involved for a few years, and then last year I actually ended up being one of the official editors for the anthology.
And so is it 4 anthologies you've had so far?
The group has actually started the process for 17 of them.
Wow.
Right? Not all of them have been published. Some of them kind of petered out. Some of them ended up living as they're like microfiction, so they're on a small website. So the ones that have actually been published in paperback and that you could purchase, I think number 10 or 12 that the group has done. I have only been a member of the group for 4 years now, I think. So I just kind of came right in, did a year of nano, and then they were like, be an ML. I'm like, okay. And then it just kind of got caught up in also the greater group that happens year round.
Okay.
Which is absolutely fine because, like I said before, you want writers, you hang out with them, and if your friends are writers, then you're all writing.
Yes. Yeah. And as I say, it's very, very empowering. So thinking about the anthology, so I mentioned this to my group, and they kind of like took my arm off. They were like, yes, this is something we want to do. So for me, I'm not entirely sure about how to set something like that up. So how does your anthology work?
Very different than standard anthologies that you would probably think of. So, because as a short story author, I tend to submit to a lot of anthologies. And usually what happens is the editor will pull out the call, like, hey, here's what we're looking for. You submit a story, and you're like, accepted or not? Okay, whatever. Here's a contract if you did. If not, move on to the next market. What we actually do for ours is a lot more elaborate, may or may not be the right word there, but it's a lot more structured and it's more designed as a workshop.
Okay.
So what happens is, and it's also, while there are editors, relatively democratic. Okay. So the group as a whole votes on what do we want the theme of the anthology to be. And then once that is determined, the editors get together and they try to clarify it. So what do we want the theme to actually mean? What type of guidance do we want to give our authors? What type of limits might we want to set? Is this going to be a PG-13 anthology like most of ours have been? Are we going to have a word count limit, 3,000, 5,000, and figure out the mechanics of it? And then we put out the call and say, okay, write your stories and give us your first drafts. Okay. And then comes the true workshop part of the anthology. So what ends up happening is, as editors, we would read all of these stories. And so this can be up to like 50 stories, depending on how many people want to submit. Wow. And we're evaluating it, like what might need work, what might not need work, does this fit within our themes? And at the same time, while we're going through this story, we are assigning other people within the anthology to do critiques. Okay. So your first draft is getting looked at not only by an editor, but also by 3 other authors. Okay. Right. And then you do it again. Okay. So you submit your second draft, and the same thing happens. Okay. As you will get those 3 different critiques from different authors in the anthology. Turn in your second draft, turn in your third draft, get 3 more rounds of critiques, okay. And then we get to your final story, which is the 4th draft.
And how long does that piece of the process take?
It will vary. Okay. So it varies usually depending on how many authors are in the anthology. The more authors you have, the more time we found that we had to give them. We try to finish a lot of the writing and critiques usually in the summer. So we kick it off in January. So by like July, we like to have all of that done. And then the editor's work really like steps up to plate here, because then you might have had a theme, but what's the title going to be? What's the cover going to look like? How are we going to group stories into like-minded sections, perhaps? Writing a contract, what type of rights do we want to ask for? Getting those contracts from the authors. And then going through the actual hard bit of preparing it for publication, like taking all these messy documents in Google Docs and turning it into a file that we could submit to Amazon. Okay. So you're with the process like the entire time, the way we do it. So it makes it a little intensive, but we tend to start to finish. The process will take 12 to 14 months.
Wow. Okay. So you aim to do 1 anthology a year. Is that right?
Ideally, okay. Yeah. We always try, because there's overlap between the editors of the anthology and then our nano municipal liaisons. So it's not just me, it's me and two others. And so we always want to have the anthology out and done before nano hits, because we know we're going to have no time to do anything. It never happens. So we're lucky if we get it published. So usually we will have it published the following January. No one wants to do anything during Christmas either, like after nano, you're like, I need a break. So it takes, that 12 to 14 months, but there is breaks in between it.
Okay.
So if you were 100% dedicated to it, you definitely could probably turn it around with our process in about 10 months.
Okay. But then you would have your day job, your own writing, and your anthology work. That's a big workload.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is definitely a commitment. And sometimes it will take away from other things. I think people always, and not just also from an editor standpoint, but even if you're just a contributing author, because you're writing 4 drafts, but then you also have to critique 9 different stories.
Yes.
Maybe more, depending on how many stories we have. We match it up. So for each story you submit, you have to critique 3. So if you submit 2 stories to the anthology, each round you're doing 6.
Okay. So, I mean, even logistically, that sounds like a nightmare, trying to do that kind of critiquing rota.
Oh yeah, I had color-coded Excel charts. I would have this thing. I was like, okay, so these people all submitted stories of similar story lengths, so let's prioritize it and have them try to read each other's work. Okay. But then it got difficult as you went through each round, because in my mind, you don't want to read the same story twice.
Okay.
So sometimes you also don't want to read the same author twice, because the stylistic similarities, you're like, I already read something, let me do something new. And having that difference of opinion can be enlightening sometimes. So you want to give people different exposure to different writings and different authors. And so by the end of it, sometimes I would be like, okay, I know this story is a poem and you submitted like a longer short story, but I'm still going to have you critique it, because everything else that I would match you with has already been taken and you've already read it. So it gets a little thin by the end, but you're also expecting by the third critiques that these are pretty solid. And you will see that going through. Like, there's a lot more developmental shifts that will happen between the first and second draft, and maybe the second and the third. Okay. But by the time people are submitting the 4th draft, it's pretty good. And we still have copy editors go through and do that, of course. Also, that's on the editors. But we'll have extra volunteers help us with some of the copy editing.
So how do you... Okay, so, you have come from an environment where, you've critiqued at college, you've critiqued with, a writing group. I'm assuming a lot of these authors, it's kind of their first time kind of through the gate. I'm not asking for horror stories, but how do you handle, conflicts? Because, writing is a very personal thing. And unless you've had that experience of being critiqued, the first time you get critiqued, it's like the first time you get a terrible review. How do you kind of manage if that seems to be happening?
Hard to do. And I say that with full honesty, because a lot of times the problem person might be me.
That's honest.
I tend to be, right? Well, and kind of like what I said before, like, to me, critiques are meant to be critical. They are meant to be something to help you go forward. And I expect to be judged very harshly. And so I can be very harsh and frank in my critiques. So a lot of times the conflicts might be people didn't like my critique. That has happened a few times. This is because I am too harsh. I am too frank. I am very objective. So I know for me, like, what ends up helping me is I go and I read like other people's critiques, so I can see how I can taper things down. And that tends to be a common issue that we have seen with other people, is because it is a mix of authors. Most authors at this point who go through the anthology have had something published, even if it's just through this anthology. Because, like I said, the group has put one regularly out, one like every year. Usually we have one or two new people. And so what we have started doing is before we assign critiques the first time, we have a workshop on how to do critiques.
Okay, good.
Good. How to sandwich things, how to make sure that people understand that a critique is your opinion, and specifically your opinion.
Yes.
And part of that also gets into how you should be evaluating critiques if you're the person receiving it. I feel like that's the flip side of critiquing, is you have to teach people how to do it correctly. But then you also have to prime people to know that this is not like a personal attack. This is something that is very specific to the writing. It's kind of a two-pronged education approach. And different people need different sides of it. But that's something that we definitely try to do. Having people do the multiple critiques is something that also helps with that, because then you're not completely reliant on a critique that maybe you don't like.
Okay.
You have the ability to look at multiple things. And so I think that also helps prevent conflicts that we've seen. So two people might have the same opinions, but some person might say it a lot more harshly than the other. And then sometimes the editor might have to come in and be like, yes, but let's look aside from tone and try to get into just the meat of it and helping people with that. That's definitely a conflict that we have to mediate. Sometimes, like when we're assigning other critiques, to prevent conflicts, like if I know people aren't getting along, I won't let them interact. So if I know two authors don't get along, I'll make sure that they're not critiquing each other's stories.
Because you mean not getting on literally as two human beings? Oh, right. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I need to think about
if you have two, it's a big group. There's a few strong personalities, so you have to know which ones tend to butt heads and don't give them the opportunity to butt heads. That's definitely part of what goes into it.
It sounds like trying to do like a table plan for a wedding.
Oh yeah.
Or
I spent some time, even though I'm an analyst now, like I spent a few years as a teacher, like subbing kindergartners, subbing second graders. Like that is chaos, and sometimes this feels like the same. But and that's pretty much how you have to try to prevent conflicts, is try to and it helps because I have been critiquing for so long, and the editors on this anthology have gone through the process a few times. We kind of see the pitfalls, and so when we kick off each process, we do our best to mitigate and reduce the chance of those conflicts even happening. Here's how you do a critique workshop, and then selectively assigning critiques.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess that's something that just comes with experience as you work through the anthologies. You probably, because first time you get through, I mean, you're not going to know who hates who unless one of the other editors tell you.
Correct. Yeah. And it used to be easier to tell when we would meet in person.
Okay.
Because when the writers group is getting together in our monthly meetings and everyone is mingling, and you could kind of keep an eye on things. It was much harder this past year because everything was online.
Okay. Yeah, and I think if you're in a room with people, you can see their body language and you can read that and you can think, okay, well, she definitely doesn't like her and he doesn't like him, and okay. Right. So everyone's got their stories. They've been critiqued. You've got your theme. You didn't mention about, writing the copy in terms of like book jacket stuff, thinking about the title. How do you go about?
Yeah, editors do that too.
Okay. And then
that happens after all the stories are in, like when we're figuring out the title and the cover.
Yeah. I mean, I write a little bit of copy like before I kind of start, and then at the end, obviously, as the story changes, I'll kind of rewrite it for the book jacket. What? How do you go around doing covers?
So it varies. In the anthology that we released, well, last year's anthology, which ended up being released this January, for example, one of the contributing authors had a friend who was a graphic designer.
Perfect.
And so we reached out to him, and he said that he could help us. So there was kind of like a group effort. So he would give us a few examples, and then we would say, hey, can we try to do this? Can we like there was, lots of pots, cooks in the kitchen type of deal. But we ended up working with a designer to help us with this cover, which worked out really well, I think. It looks good, and then he was able to do the front and the back. I know in previous anthologies, it would just be maybe something that one of the authors came up with. I think for one of our anthologies, we had just like pretty out of focus lights, and that was the cover because it was like a stock image we could get. But we have worked the past two. So the most recent one was Masks, Facades, and Reveals. We had the graphic designer, and then the one before that, which was called Stranded, we actually someone's spouse is a photographer. I think that's what it was, who had provided an image.
Yeah, I mean, personally speaking, those are my two favorite covers of the 4 anthologies that I've seen, because obviously I saw them linked to your Goodreads account.
Not all of those anthologies, I think, on my Goodreads account are from the group. Some of them are other ones that I had just
So, and then, I mean, that was the thing I wanted to talk to you about, contracts, because I don't think many groups would necessarily think about rights and contracts. It kind of feels like, we'll put this thing together and we'll send it out, and then, we'll use the money to buy, cookies at the next write-in. But it sounds like you guys are doing it, I don't want to say seriously. You're doing it kind of by the book. So what are your kind of rights setups?
So we ask for world first English anthology rights. Sometimes we might have someone submit a story that's actually a reprint. In that case, we will actually change the contract for them. But that's pretty much what it is. World rights. So, and there's like a variety of different rights that you can ask for. But essentially what that means is we're asking for the right to be the first to publish the story in the world.
I see.
Mainly because it's also something that, through Amazon, you can get that global distribution.
Okay. And then how do you, so you have, how many writers did you have in your last anthology?
39.
Okay. So how on earth do you...
It might be less. Sorry. I might be getting my numbers mixed up. It might be 39 stories from 24 authors.
Okay. So from a royalties perspective, how...
Even split.
Okay. But somebody somewhere has the money coming to them. So I guess they need to be transparent about what royalties have come in and then work it all out. Okay.
Yeah, so that's one of my co-MLs and fellow anthology editor, is technically all of our contracts we are selling rights to him. And then every year he sends up an updated list of like, okay, here's everything that we've sold. Here's what that profit split is. Here's the money you can expect if you want it. So it's not uncommon for authors to decide that instead of taking the royalty checks, for example, they might donate it to the NATO region.
Okay.
And then we use that money when we're not in COVID times and all digital. We'll use it to reserve rooms for like kickoff parties or an all-day write-in when we're meeting in person.
Okay. That sounds like you're making some good money then. To be able to hire a room. I mean, I don't know what the prices are like where you are, but...
The rooms are pretty cheap, I'll be honest, because it's the government building, right. So it's not like we're renting from like the city hall, so it's usually pretty cheap. We clean up after ourselves, like that's kind of part of the deal. But it works out well. So we don't have, our expenses aren't super high. So our expenses are probably for room rentals anyways, I think they're under $100 a year.
okay.
So like pretty cheap.
Right.
Yeah. And I wouldn't say the royalties that we get are super high because again, it's a even split.
Yeah.
So if a book is selling for $10, then you have to split that with over 20 authors. You know, you're not getting a lot there, but it has been year over year. There has at least been something that we could choose whether we want to take it or if we want to donate it to the group.
And what do you think the advantages are to doing an anthology?
In the way that we do it?
Yeah.
So there's a few. So I think the big advantage is actually the workshop nature of it. So a lot of people, this is their way of having a story critiqued and improved, and you can see things happen over the course of the year. That's part of the fun as an editor is you're like, oh, I remember the first draft of this. Look at it now. So that is a huge draw and a huge benefit, I think, for a lot of the authors. Right. And because I've been involved with it for a few years at this point, I could also see authors improve year over year with their stories in the anthology. That is the big advantage here. Of course, people like to be published, and we do try to do it as legitimate as possible. Like you said, we have a contract, we're publishing it online. We have people, not just us, buying it. We tend to do like we'll have the print books and we'll also try to seed our local libraries with it. So the most recent one, like I seeded all my local free little libraries. I'm like, oh, people took it. That made me so happy. They didn't just sit there. People actually took it.
Great.
So that would be another advantage is you always get that thrill when you see your name in print. And I'm still kind of sad that my first publication was audio and not print because I don't have that first thing, but I have the audio file. And I'm like, yes. And I still have the contract saved in my computer. I'm like, yes. But that's what a lot of people want. And not everyone has the wherewithal or even the knowledge of how to get a short story into publication. How to research markets is a skill. Markets themselves are also very selective. It's not uncommon. Like you'll go on some of the websites that will track market acceptance rates and they're like 0.1%. Really? So it's really hard sometimes. And so this is a way to help people improve and also give them that sense of self-worth that, yes, look, I have been published. I have an author and people actually buy it and enjoy it.
So
that's really all anyone wants.
Yeah. So something that's just popped into my mind. Okay. So if I tell somebody I'm a writer, first question is, what do you write? And then the second question is, but are you traditionally published or are you self-published? Because I think there's that thing about sort of credibility. So the writers that take part in your anthology, do they consider themselves self-published or traditionally published?
They consider themselves self-published, but they would still call themselves published authors.
Okay, yeah. And then as a short story writer, do you think you have... Do you think the odds are better at being traditionally published than they are if you're writing nonfiction?
That's a really good question. And the analyst brain in my head wants to actually go Google numbers right now. But I will say this. In the few long things that I have written and I have tried to submit, I tend to have better success at generating interest for that than I have with short stories.
Okay.
So it is not uncommon for me to send out a short story to a variety of publications over 2 years and then not get a single acceptance for it.
Wow.
Whereas I had a novel that I shopped around last year and I actually ended up getting 6 manuscript full requests.
Okay.
No one decided to actually represent me, which is fine.
Sure.
But having 6 agents tell me on the same story, hey, there is merit in this. Let me read it. Let me push it to the next level. That happened way more likely with one story than I would with my short stories.
Okay.
I have one that's circulating right now. Like I said, it's probably pushing 1.5 years because it just takes so long sometimes for markets to get back to you.
Yeah.
I've had 2 positive receptions to it, as in notifications that it made it to the final round of consideration. Okay. So it's probably easier. I think it's also because there's more money and it's a bigger market for the longer novel works and short stories. A lot of short story publications don't have huge readership.
Oh, okay. I always think of short stories.
I mean, there are some big ones, but a lot of times, like, well, think about your own reading habits. If you're picking up something to read, what are you going for? A novel or an anthology or a single short story on a website, maybe?
I always think of short stories as being in a magazine. So yeah, I hadn't really thought about a short story in an anthology. I did have a question about submitting short stories. I've only because I've never done it, but certainly I see in competitions, people are charged often for entering something into a competition. Is that the same for you, or are you, if you are submitting to the places that you are submitting, it's free to you?
It's free, and if it's not, I don't submit.
Right. Okay.
So there's that age-old adage, I suppose, that money should flow to the author. Yes. So as soon as I'm being asked to pay to like enter a contest, perhaps, or to submit, then I just don't do it. Honestly, a lot of the, and I think all of the prorated markets. So that's places that would, see, again, there's just like not a lot of money in short stories. A pro rate is 10 cents a word. Okay. And if your story is 1,000 words, like, but they don't charge for you to submit your story because all of the money should be going to the author.
Yeah, I agree.
And that is another danger in a lot of short story markets, is not all of them, because they don't have the reader base and they don't charge perhaps for the material, will actually pay authors. So I know some of the other authors that have been in the group's anthologies with me have gotten pieces published elsewhere as well, but they have been in non-paying markets. And so people, especially new authors, I feel like anytime you see your name, like, you're so excited about it. And sometimes people will do that trade-off of having that publication credit versus actually getting paid for it. And that's something that me, like, from a business standpoint, like, if I'm not going to get above a certain payment per word, I'm just not going to pay for it, or I'm not going to submit, and I'm not going to pay to have my story submitted someplace. That's a choice I've made.
It's always been something I've always wondered about. Like, are these people trying to make money, or are they just trying to cover their costs?
It's, if they are for contests, it's probably a little bit of both, because especially if it's a cash prize, then you have to have that money for the cash prize come somewhere. There are contests, however, where you don't have to pay for that entry fee. And I'm sure there might be some type of thank you fee for judges too, perhaps. Sometimes you will see markets say that, hey, we ask for like maybe $1 submission fee to help cover the cost of the software that they use in order for you to submit something through. But anytime there's that situation where they're asking the author to pay to submit, the place you're submitting to probably isn't self-sufficient. So there's no guarantee that they're going to be around for very long. There's no guarantee that they're going to have money to give you. There's no guarantee either how much your story might have in terms of exposure. So if some place is asking you to pay $1 to submit, and then they're not actually like giving you any payment afterwards, or very small payment, sometimes you'll see like, okay, we'll pay a flat fee of $5, but if your story by the word could have gotten you more someplace else, then again, that's another trade-off you have to consider. So it can be, it's definitely a world you have to navigate, and you have to learn. And when you first start diving in there, it can be definitely very, very scary and overwhelming. And you're just like, what is going on? There's some good resources out there to help people.
Yeah, it just seems like a completely different world. I did want to come back to something you said about libraries, because I've noticed that the format that I published in, the book size, there was a warning that came up, and I just kind of ignored it, that it wasn't a book size that Amazon would supply to a library. And it was very odd. It was like 1/4 of an inch. If I'd changed the format of the book by 1/4 of an inch, they would have supplied it to libraries. Is that a conscious decision that you made, or are you literally printing copies and taking it into a library?
The latter.
All right. Okay.
So what ends up happening is we will buy discounted author copies. So it's, less than market price for us. And we make sure it tends to be very individual. So as a group, we have connections with 2 libraries, because when we're meeting in person, that's where we tend to have our meetings, and we have good relationships with them. So we give them, here, thank you for supporting us. Here's the result of your support type of copies. And then here locally, I have connections with 2 of my local libraries. So one of them, this past Nano, actually hosted some of our virtual write-ins. So through the library, they would advertise the write-in, and then I would host it on Zoom and such. And then there's another local library who has an online critique group that I will pop in occasionally. And so I was able to approach both of my contacts at the library and say, do you have a collection for local authors? Okay. They both said yes. So then I was able to give them copies of the anthology. And it is specifically in sections of the library that's like, hey, here, look at this. But it is me paying for a copy of the book and then donating it. Okay. And I did the same thing for the free little libraries. So that is me paying for extra copies of the anthology and then seeding it throughout the neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, that still raises the profile of it as well. And I guess, yes, if you've got, 24 writers, you've got 24 people doing some marketing as well.
To some extent. So we've had, it was actually kind of like a hiccup we had with our past anthology. Okay. I wanted to do a marketing campaign. And then we had difficulties with, we put it on Amazon, and then Amazon didn't have like a delay or a wait period. So as soon as we uploaded it, there was the buy. Okay. We couldn't have a pre-order link. And that meant if we had sent people to the Amazon site to pre-order, they would have been getting a proof copy and not one that we were officially ready for. So we found that we couldn't like truly do a marketing campaign until we were sure that when we directed people to the site to buy, that they would be getting the right version. So it was kind of haphazard. But once everything was good, everyone, and not everyone in the anthology has, for example, a social media profile. But those who did were pretty good about like, look, hey, here's this. And then we would reblog and respond to people's works. I know a lot of people in the anthology will also like email blast their family and friends. So
yeah, because I guess you've got that. You do have that kind of built-in family friends audience as well. How then, if somebody's thinking of putting an anthology together, what advice would you give them?
Be very clear up front as to what you want the anthology to be. So it will prevent a lot of issues later on. So have clear-cut understandings of like what you want the word count to be, what you want the rating of stories to be, what type of stories that you're looking for. So if you are expecting, for example, to edit an anthology that's all horror stories, make sure people know that. So you're not going to get submissions of romances. It will save you a little bit of a headache. Okay. So be very clear in your communication with your authors, straight from the beginning and then all the way through. Even then when you're communicating deadlines and contracts and any updates to the project, make sure that you're also keeping the authors updated, because they will ask.
Yes.
They're like, how's it going? How's it coming along? So good communication is definitely the number one piece of advice I have.
Okay, fantastic. That's all great stuff, and I'm definitely gonna take on all of that when I kick off this anthology with my group. Which,
let me know if you have any questions about it. I can help you, Stuart.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Gwen. I guess the final question is, where can people find you and your work online?
Oh yeah, so Twitter and Instagram are probably the best bets. So for both of them, my username is Gwen Tolios, no space. So that is GWENTOLIOS.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Well, thank you again. It's been an absolute delight talking to you today. And
same here.
Great. Thank you for joining. Take care.
You too.